All right, we are continuing our podcast series on the Ten Commandments as we look at the seventh commandment, which comes from Exodus 20, verse 14. You shall not commit adultery. All right, so join me on this exciting episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Methodical Methodist Podcast, a podcast where we talk about why the church is still relevant for us today as we explore themes connected to religion, politics, pop culture, faith, and yes, even the church. Together we can find out what it means to live into the mission of the church by making disciples. Now, let's get methodical.
The Protestant reformer Martin Luther once said that in the sixth commandment, you shall not murder, we learn how to live next door to our neighbor. But in the seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery, we learn how to live with a neighbor who lies next to us in bed. With our current culture and the resources that we have access to, especially on the internet, it's easier than ever to break this commandment. Believe it or not, there's actually a website out there called ashleymadison.com that is specifically designed to help married people cheat on their spouses. This is a real thing. They have commercials and everything. And as of 2014, there are 25 million members in 37 countries who are married and looking to break their marriage vows. In fact, Ashley Madison's slogan is, "Life is short, have an affair." Adultery is often a subject of gossip, but it has become more casual over time. And it's almost become normal. Things have certainly changed from the days of the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy 22, we're told that the penalty for adultery is death for both men and women. For those in ancient Israel, committing adultery was an assault on the community. It was dealt with by the community and for the sake of the community. That is why public stoning was the method used for those who dared to break this commandment. The Jewish people dealt very seriously with this because breaking this commandment breaks the marriage covenant with your spouse and with God. As one scholar states, our faithfulness to each other affects our faithfulness to God. In the United Methodist hymnal, we have a service of Christian marriage that begins by saying, "Friends, we are gathered together in the sight of God." Couples present their vows to each other, and they do so in the name of God. In the declaration of marriage, it says, "You have declared your consent and vows before God and this congregation. May God confirm your covenant and fill you both with grace." When your marriage vows are broken, so is this covenant that goes before your spouse and also God. Faithfulness and fidelity are a crucial part of marriage. In marriage, you vow to love, comfort, honor, keep in sickness and in health, and forsake all others in order to be a faithful person, to be a faithful spouse. It's meant to last a lifetime. And some of you may be listening to this and thinking, well, I'm off the hook because I'm not married. Or you may be thinking, well, there's no way that I would ever cheat on my spouse. Maybe thinking, how in the world is this commandment applied to me? Much like our last commandment, this one is one that some folks think is an easy one to keep, but Jesus lets us know that even if we haven't explicitly committed adultery, it doesn't mean that we aren't still guilty. In the last episode, we talked about how Jesus argues that even being angry with someone makes us guilty of murder. And now Jesus intensifies the law concerning adultery. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 32, Jesus says this, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. Jesus sets the bar pretty high for us when it comes to this commandment. Jesus does something that he is often guilty of doing. He refocuses the conversation. He opens things up and forces us to look at our inner thoughts and motives. He moves the standard away from not committing adultery to not committing lust instead. So even if you've never cheated on your spouse, or even if you're single and not married, Jesus extends this commandment to everyone. Just when we think we're good, just when we think we're safe, Jesus has a way of bringing us back in and challenging us. Jesus has a way of pointing out sins in our lives that we never realized were there before. As Bishop Will Willimon says, when looking at this notoriously difficult statement, who knows of a human who has never committed lust? In an interview published in November 1976, then Governor Jimmy Carter received a lot of criticism when he talked about the role of religion in his life. And in one part of this interview, he said, "I try not to commit a deliberate sin. I recognize that I'm going to do it anyway because I'm human and I'm tempted. And Christ set some almost impossible standards for us. Christ said, 'I tell you that anyone who looks on a woman with lust has already in his heart committed adultery.'" Carter goes on to say, "I've looked on a lot of women with lust. I've committed adultery in my heart many times. This is something that God recognizes I will do, and I've done it, and God forgives me for it." As Thomas Aquinas once said, lust is congenial to our nature. Lust is in our nature, and it affects both men and women. So it's clear that all people struggle with this sin at some point in their lives and to some degree. And I think Jesus realized how difficult this can be. Perhaps that's why his words are so strong in Matthew 5:29-30, when he says, "So if your eye, even your good eye, causes you to lust, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your hand, even your stronger hand, causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell." In this passage, of course, Jesus is using hyperbole. He doesn't want us to literally gouge out our eyes or cut off our hands when we sin. N.T. Wright, one of the greatest New Testament scholars of our time, says, Jesus is telling us to deal ruthlessly with the first signs of sin. At first, it seems that Jesus is forbidding us to look at someone else, but we were made to appreciate beauty. The one who is condemned is the one who looks deliberately with lust. It's not the initial impulse, but what we do with that impulse that is the problem. In his book, Making Love Last a Lifetime, Reverend Adam Hamilton tells about the story about a friend who fell into the temptation of sin. He says this: "It all began with a look across a room. There was an energy there. I fell in love with her, if you could call it that, during a hug. It all seemed very innocent, and yet it was very alluring. We were both married, and we were both empty. We were two needy people who were drawn to each other. One day she admitted her feelings for him, and the die was cast. There was no turning back. After 3 months, they broke off the relationship when their affair was discovered." Adam Hamilton's friend said, "It was like I woke up from a dream and realized how stupid I had been. What was I thinking? And I immediately separated from her." Unfortunately, this is a common story that can really happen to anybody. It starts out innocent, but then it quickly gets out of hand. Some relationships survive affairs and some don't. Again, it's not the initial impulse, but what we do with that impulse that is the problem. I'm reminded of King David. He knew the temptation and obsession of lust all too well. David lusted for a woman named Bathsheba who was married to a man named Uriah. David and Bathsheba broke the seventh commandment, and they conceived a child. And David wanted to cover up his act of adultery. So David tried to trick Uriah into coming home from battle so that he could be with his wife, Bathsheba. Uriah refused to do so because he didn't feel like it was right to do this while his comrades were still in battle. So David sent Uriah into the heat of battle, into the front lines, and had him killed. David committed some terrible sins. He broke several of the commandments in this story. He coveted Bathsheba, he committed adultery, he lied about his actions, and he had Uriah murdered. David did all of these things, and somehow God still used him despite all of his very serious mistakes. This story shows us that no one is too far from God's grace. But his actions were not okay. But still, God is so powerful and so good that God can redeem anyone. I wonder if a better way to address this commandment is by flipping it. So instead of saying, "You shall not commit adultery," we can say, "You shall cherish the sacredness which is inherent in you and your spouse." So how can we cherish the relationship that we are committed to right now? What are the ways that we can honor the relationships that we have with those we care about? How can we treat not only our spouses, but other human beings with respect? How can we be faithful to the people around us? Maybe you need to go to counseling. Maybe you need to go on a marriage retreat. Maybe you can make an effort to set aside time away from the kids, away from work, just to spend some quality time with your loved one. And if you're not married, maybe you can reach out to those who are close to you and those that are faithful friendships that you have. Because I think this commandment invites us to practice fidelity, not just in our marriages, but in all of our relationships. It invites us to find ways to reach out to others as we strive to be faithful to God. It invites us to be a source of grace and understanding for others. This idea is illustrated in the story about a woman who is caught in adultery. The Pharisees bring this woman who has been caught in this act of adultery in front of a crowd and in front of Jesus. For whatever reason, the man is not there. Maybe he ran, maybe the Pharisees let him go. We don't really know what happened to him. But they bring the woman among this crowd. And they ask Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. The law of Moses says to stone her, but what do you say?" The Pharisees argue that this is what the Torah clearly states. The punishment for adultery is death by stoning. Everyone in the crowd already has a stone in their hand. They are ready to kill this woman. After all, that is how the law has been carried out for generations. And the Pharisees are trying to trick Jesus by asking him about his opinion. They say, "This is what the law of Moses says, but what do you say?" And without a word, Jesus stoops down and he begins to draw in the dust with his finger. He writes something there in the dust, and as the Pharisees continue to question him, Jesus just kind of writes there in the dust, not speaking anything. And it's kind of interesting that the Gospel of John tells the story and adds this little detail because he fails to tell us what Jesus actually wrote in the dirt. The Pharisees continue to question him until finally Jesus straightens up, and then like an artful politician, Jesus says, "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And then, just like that, he goes right back to drawing in the dirt. One by one, the folks, beginning with the elders, leave until finally it's just Jesus and the woman left standing there. And again, Jesus stands up and says, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" It's almost like Jesus has been off in his own little world, and then he snaps back into reality and he realizes that everyone in the crowd has gone. And he sees that his answer to the Pharisees did the trick. And the woman hears this from Jesus, and she responds, "No one has condemned me." To which Jesus replies, "Well, neither do I. Go and sin no more." Notice that Jesus doesn't condone her sin, but he also doesn't shame her. He doesn't lecture her. He doesn't make all the arguments as to why committing adultery is wrong. Jesus offers no damnation whatsoever. Instead, Jesus offers grace. He simply offers grace. We live in a world where we sometimes are eager to offer judgment rather than grace. Years ago, growing up, I remember my pastor, Drew Henry, talking about this story of the woman caught in adultery. And he asked a question. He said, think of all those people who were crowded around with stones in their hands. Do you think they dropped their stones when they heard Jesus' response? Do you think they dropped their stones when they turned to leave? Or do you think they held on to them, waiting for the next opportunity to cast their stones of judgment? Drew Henry tended to think that they probably held on to their stones. He argued that it's harder to offer grace than to offer damnation. But what about us? Are we holding on to our stones? Are we carrying them around waiting for an opportunity to arise so that we can throw them? If we truly listen to what Jesus tells us about adultery, then it won't take long for us to realize that we are all guilty. We have an opportunity to come before God on our knees asking for forgiveness for our mistakes and failures. We have an opportunity to accept the love and grace of God who receives us and forgives us. Whenever we try to claim the moral high ground, we are in danger of deceiving ourselves and denying the grace that we need. And when we do that, we fall into the same trap that the Pharisees fell into. So maybe it's time to put down our stones. As we think about this very difficult commandment, my hope is that we can find ways to live faithful lives with the people that we are in relationship with. My hope is that we can find ways to be faithful to Jesus Christ. Because fidelity is not an attribute that comes easily. But God is the one who models what it means to be in right relationship with others. In the words of one of my old professors, the Reverend Don Chesser, the good news is God knows we can't do this perfectly. We can try, and we can pray, and we can work on our relationships by doing unto others as we would have them do unto us. And we can work on honoring our commitments. We can work on our spiritual selves, but we will surely be working on it for all of our lives and continuing to make mistakes. But we need not worry. This is not the end of us because, as John Wesley put it, we are going on to perfection when our righteousness will be abounding, exceeding even that of the scribes and the Pharisees. And in the meantime, there is grace enough to carry us along, despite our human failure. Praise be to God for grace in Jesus Christ. Jesus tells the woman to go and sin no more. And it's only through the power of the Holy Spirit that we can do that. We can find God's grace in Jesus Christ.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Methodical Methodist Podcast. If you have enjoyed this show, I hope you might consider heading on over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review of the show. It is very much appreciated. And until next time, stay methodical.